To send check or money order or use your credit card.
This is CNN.
This is CNN's Prime News, taking the time to examine world events, issues, and newsmakers. With Bernard Shaw in Washington and Susan Rook in Atlanta.
Thanks for joining us. 47 years ago, world leaders molded the building blocks of the United Nations from the ashes of World War II. Today, world leaders began to remodel that foundation of peace. The 15 Security Council members gathered at a first-ever summit in New York. CNN World Affairs correspondent Ralph Begleiter reports an air of tension hung over the meeting.
China's Premier Li Peng found himself alone most of the day at the United Nations, the odd man out. It was Li's first appearance in such an international forum since he ordered the brutal crackdown on China's democracy movement in Tiananmen Square in 1989. China's isolation at the UN was in sharp contrast to the display of closeness put on all day by George Bush and Boris Yeltsin, who was also making his debut in the seat once occupied by the Soviet Union. In their speeches, the U.S. and Russian presidents seemed to team up against China.
Democracy, human rights, the rule of law, these are the building blocks of peace and freedom. Human dignity, the inalienable rights of man, these are not the possessions of the state. They're universal.
Yeltsin went out of his way to distinguish the way Russia now treats political dissidents from the way China does.
I believe that these questions are not an internal matter of states, but rather their obligations under the UN Charter. In free Russia, there are no longer any prisoners of conscience.
Implied criticism of China on human rights came from French President François Mitterrand and from the chairman of the Security Council Summit, British Prime Minister John Major.
There's great dissatisfaction in the United Nations and elsewhere with the human rights record in China.
Just as President Bush held a curt meeting with the Chinese leader, Mr. Bush's administration issued a human rights report, sharply criticizing China's treatment of political dissidents. But Li Peng's answer at the summit was, butt out.
It is opposed to interference in the internal affairs of other countries using the human rights issue as an excuse.
China's isolation at the summit did not keep the others from displaying a new cordiality and new support for the United Nations itself. A far cry from Nikita Khrushchev pounding the UN podium and referring to the Security Council as a spittoon. Now, UN peacekeepers are at work around the world, and last year's anti-Iraq coalition is an accomplishment under the UN's belt. Many of the leaders who took part in the Security Council summit echoed U.S. and Russian calls for more disarmament and controls to keep nuclear and missile technology from falling into the wrong hands. The first ever meeting of the heads of government probably lends new clout to the United Nations and its Security Council. Ralph Begleiter, CNN at the United Nations.
The Bush administration's new report on human rights is tough on China, but some people think the timing is suspect. CNN's Anthony Collins reports critics are accusing the president of pulling his human rights punches.
The State Department accused China of continuing repression since the Tiananmen Square massacre, but it delayed issuing its human rights report until just before President Bush met Chinese Premier Li Peng. An independent human rights group, while applauding the report's conclusions on China, calls the delay an outrage.
And the very idea that the entire document has been suppressed for a couple of hours to save our president the embarrassment of having to sit down and look in the eye the man about whom we have written in this report strikes me as a scandal.
State Department officials deny any political motive.
We had certain problems that we still had to resolve, and we're resolving them
in the China chapter,
not involving China.
The report itself had harsh words. It said in China last year there were documented cases of torture and mistreatment of those accused of crimes, including the use of cattle prods. The U.S. said that during Secretary of State Baker's visit to Beijing last November, prison officials broke the arm of a political prisoner on hunger strike. Baker wanted the International Committee of the Red Cross to check on prison conditions in China.
Secretary Baker, during his visit to China, made a particular point of urging that China agree to ICRC examination of prisons. And I'm afraid there hasn't been any progress in that suggestion.
Great progress in human rights was made in the former Soviet Union, the report said. Communism fell, and with it went Soviet repression in that part of the world. But U.S. officials said many other countries still trample on human rights. Among the worst, officials say, North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, Syria, Iraq, and Kuwait. America's ally Israel came in for milder criticism. The U.S. expressed concern about abuses by both Israelis and Palestinians, but it noted a drop in the number of Palestinians killed or detained as the Intifada uprising scaled down. Some analysts saw a deliberate attempt to be even-handed.
And particularly at this moment, when these kinds of things can disrupt the peace process, it's very careful to be fair.
U.S. officials say there's less fear of the midnight knock on the door in many countries now that Soviet-style communism is gone. But the imprisonment of political dissidents and their torture and execution is still the way of life in China and many other countries. Anthony Collins, CNN, at the State Department.
The fate of 11,600 Haitian refugees at a Guantanamo Bay holding facility has not been decided, contrary to an earlier announcement today. Clerks of the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals erroneously issued an order saying the government could forcibly send the refugees back to Haiti. But court officials say that announcement was made in error. The Guantanamo Bay facility could reach its capacity next week as more Haitians are rescued at sea.
Still ahead on Prime News, fed up with your cable television service? Well, you're not alone, but help may be on the way. It's happened again. Another major airline nosedives into bankruptcy court. And it's a condom with a difference. It may soon be showing up at a store near you. And later, we've told you how prices are skyrocketing in Russia. Guess what a Big Mac costs these days? We'll tell you. If the U.S. Senate gets its way, cable TV viewers won't have to worry as much about big rate hikes and poor service. CNN's Carl Rochelle explains why.
Complaints by cable TV users about increasing rates for decreasing service have grown almost as fast as the number of channels on cable systems. Friday, the U.S. Senate showed it was listening.
The public is outraged at the present state of affairs. The public wants something done, and the public wants something real done, not something cosmetic.
The Senate passed a bill that would require the Federal Communications Commission to establish national guidelines for quality of service and regulating basic cable rates.
In 1986, my constituents paid $12 for 30 channels. $12 for 30 channels. Today, they pay $12.95. But not for 30 channels, but for 14 channels.
The bill would also require the FCC to regulate unreasonable price increases for special programming like movie channels or sporting events, set standards for customer service, and promote competition by preventing local governments from keeping second cable distributors out of a market. Critics charge the regulation would stunt the growth of a still developing industry.
I fear we're going to shoot the goose that laid the golden egg. Regulation and re-regulation is never the answer.
But Senator Al Gore says it's not a question of development or programming, it's a question of money.
The real question here is not what's happening. We know what's happening. They're taking advantage of their monopoly power to charge as much money as they possibly can.
The cable TV industry disagrees.
In fact, cable provides a good product for a relatively reasonable price. We would be the first to acknowledge that in some areas, rate increases have been unreasonable. On the whole, though, the price per channel for cable has simply followed inflation, and the 55 million people who subscribe to cable can't be all wrong.
The Senate bill now goes to the House, which is expected to pass it. But President Bush has already threatened to veto the cable regulation bill. Critics say a presidential veto would send a signal to cable companies.